In the rapidly evolving landscape of Cold War weapons technology, where guided missiles promised to make conventional artillery obsolete, and where the pace of technological change seemed to render any system over 5 years old dangerously outdated, there existed a weapon that seemed to embody everything that modern military thinking was moving away from. It was large, heavy, unmistakably old-fashioned in concept, and operated on principles that had been understood since the Second World War. It required a crew to manhandle it into position, to load it manually with ammunition that weighed as much as a small child, and to fire it from a platform that announced its presence to every enemy, within range with a spectacular blast of backfire that could be seen and heard for miles. Military theorists who surveyed the emerging guided missile technology of the 1960s looked at this weapon and saw everything that belonged to the past. Sophisticated anti-tank missiles with wire guidance systems, capable of being steered to their targets by a single operator watching through an optical sight, seemed to offer everything that the old recoilless gun could not: precision, range, the ability to engage targets from concealment, and lethality against even the most heavily armoured opponents. The days of the large, crew-served recoilless gun appeared to be numbered, and its replacement by more elegant and more technologically sophisticated solutions seemed inevitable and imminent. The weapon in question was the L6 Wombat, Britain's 120mm recoilless anti-tank gun, and the confident predictions of its early obsolescence proved to be comprehensively wrong. The Wombat would serve the British Army for 3 decades, would be trusted by the soldiers who used it in a way that newer and theoretically superior weapons struggled to replicate, and would demonstrate the enduring truth that in military equipment, as in so many other domains, the gap between theoretical superiority and practical effectiveness can be vast and consequential. This is the story of the weapon that was supposed to be obsolete before it was finished, and that instead became one of the most trusted anti-tank weapons in the British Army's Cold War inventory. The origins of the Wombat lay in the long British experience with recoilless weapons that stretched back to the latter years of the Second World War and through the Korean War of the early 1950s. The recoilless gun principle, in which propellant gas was vented rearward through the breech to cancel the recoil that would otherwise make the weapon unmanageably heavy and cumbersome, had been applied to anti-tank weapons since the war years, producing a series of weapons that offered heavy firepower in a package light enough for infantry to manhandle. The BAT, the Battalion Anti-Tank Gun, had been developed in the late 1940s, followed by the MOBAT, the Mobile Bat, and eventually the Wombat, the weapon of magnesium battalion anti-tank. The designation reflecting both the weapon's intended tactical role and the use of magnesium alloy in its construction to reduce weight compared to earlier steel construction predecessors. The Wombat entered British Army service in the early 1960s, at precisely the moment when the guided anti-tank missile was emerging as what many analysts believed would be the dominant anti-armour weapon of the future. The first generation of British anti-tank guided weapons, particularly the Vigilant missile, were becoming available at approximately the same time, and the contrast between the old-fashioned recoilless gun and the apparently futuristic guided missile was stark and immediately apparent to observers comparing the two systems. The Vigilant and its successors promised precision engagement at ranges beyond the Wombat's effective distance, with the operator guiding the missile to its target by watching it fly and making steering corrections through a joystick that commanded the missile via a thin wire paid out behind it in flight. This wire guidance system required the operator to track both the target and the missile simultaneously, making constant corrections to bring the missile's flight path onto the target. But the technology worked, and it offered capabilities that no conventional gun could match. Yet the Wombat was adopted and issued, and the reasons why this apparently anachronistic choice was made reflect the more nuanced operational thinking that lay beneath the surface of Cold War military procurement. The British Army's assessment of the anti-tank problem in the context of the Central European battlefield, where NATO forces would be expected to face massive Soviet armoured formations advancing through the German plains, was that the solution required a combination of capabilities rather than a single silver bullet technology. Guided missiles offered advantages at longer ranges and in certain tactical situations, but they also had characteristics that limited their utility in others. The decision to maintain the Wombat alongside guided missile systems reflected a realistic appreciation of what each type of weapon could and could not do, and of the specific ways in which they complemented each other. The physical reality of the Wombat was indeed formidable in scale. The weapon's barrel was 120mm in diameter, large enough to fire a projectile of genuinely devastating anti-armor capability. The complete weapon with its mounting weighed approximately 300 kilograms, a mass that made manhandling a serious physical undertaking requiring a trained crew working in coordination. The characteristic backblast produced when the weapon fired, the rearward jet of hot gas that cancelled the recoil, extended approximately 30 meters behind the weapon, and was spectacular in both visual and acoustic terms. A roaring column of fire and gas that announced the weapon's position unmistakably to anyone within sensory range. The ammunition was large and heavy, with each round requiring 2 hands to lift and considerable physical effort to load into the breech. None of this would have been surprising to any student of recoilless gun design. These were the inherent characteristics of a weapon that achieved its portability relative to conventional artillery through the recoilless principle, and they were understood and accepted as part of the system's trade-offs when the Wombat was designed. The crew who operated the Wombat were trained to manage its limitations and exploit its advantages, and the tactical doctrine for its employment was developed specifically around its physical characteristics, rather than attempting to use it as if it was something it was not. The 120mm Hesh round, high explosive squash head, that was the Wombat's primary anti-armor projectile, deserves particular attention as a key element of the weapon's effectiveness. Hesh was a distinctly British approach to anti-armor ammunition that differed fundamentally from the shaped charge heat rounds used by most other anti-tank weapons. Where a heat round used a focused jet of molten metal to penetrate armor by concentrating enormous pressure on a small area, a Hesh round worked by pressing a mass of plastic explosive against the armor surface before detonating it. The detonation created a shock wave that travelled through the armor plate and caused the inner face to spool, sending lethal fragments of metal into the interior of the vehicle at high velocity. This mechanism was particularly effective against the type of armor commonly used on Soviet vehicles, and it retained its effectiveness against thicknesses of armor that were increasing as Soviet tank design evolved. The Hesh round also had a significant advantage over heat rounds in terms of its performance characteristics during flight. Hesh rounds were stable and accurate at longer ranges because they did not rely on the precise orientation at impact that shaped charge rounds required for optimal performance. A heat round that struck at an unfavourable angle might have its penetrating jet deflected, reducing effectiveness. A Hesh round was relatively tolerant of impact angle, spreading its plastic explosive across whatever surface it contacted, and then detonating, with consistent results across a wider range of engagement geometries. This ballistic predictability contributed to the Wombat's accuracy in the hands of trained crews, and made its performance more consistent across the varied engagement conditions of realistic tactical situations. The spotting rifle was one of the Wombat's most practically significant features, an elegant solution to the problem of ranging that distinguished it from many competing weapons and directly contributed to its effectiveness in field conditions. Mounted coaxially with the main barrel, the spotting rifle fired a special tracer round whose ballistics matched those of the main Wombat round. The gunner would fire the spotting rifle at the target, observe the tracer's impact point, and use this information to confirm or correct his aim before firing the main round. This system allowed accurate first-round engagement of targets at extended ranges without the need for the elaborate range-finding equipment that some competing systems required, and it gave the crew immediate feedback on their aim before committing a large and expensive main round to the target. The simplicity of this spotting system was deeply appreciated by the crews who used the Wombat in field conditions. Alternative ranging methods, including optical rangefinders and later laser systems, were technically more sophisticated but also more complex, more subject to malfunction, more demanding of training, and more sensitive to the adverse conditions of field use. The spotting rifle required minimal training beyond the basic marksmanship skills that all gunners possessed, produced an immediately interpretable result in the form of a visible impact point on or near the target, and functioned reliably across the full range of environmental conditions that military operations imposed. When the more sophisticated ranging systems of competing weapons failed in rain, cold, or after rough handling, the Wombat's spotting rifle continued to provide the ranging information that accurate engagement required. The comparison between the Wombat and the first generation of anti-tank guided missiles that were being introduced into service during the same period is instructive about the nature of weapon system trade-offs and the importance of operational context in evaluating competing solutions. The Vigilant missile and similar first-generation systems required the operator to track both the target and the missile throughout the missile's flight to the target, a task that demanded sustained concentration and fine motor control while exposed to the stress of enemy fire and the cognitive demands of combat. Studies of first-generation ATGM performance under training conditions showed that hit probabilities were substantially lower than theoretical capabilities suggested because the manual guidance demands of the system were difficult to maintain under stress. Operators who performed well in calm training conditions sometimes failed to achieve adequate hit probabilities in realistic tactical exercises that introduced the stress, distraction, and unpredictability of simulated combat. The Wombat, by contrast, required the gunner to aim, range with the spotting rifle, and fire a single round whose subsequent flight required no further input from the crew. The engagement was complete in a matter of seconds, after which the crew could immediately prepare for the next round, relocate to avoid the backblast signature that had revealed their position, or take cover from any defensive response the target vehicle's accompanying forces might direct at them. This fire and relocate capability, made possible by the ballistic projectile's independence from crew guidance after firing, was a genuine tactical advantage in situations where the crew's survival after the first engagement was important for subsequent operations. The training burden of the Wombat was substantially lower than that of first-generation guided missile systems, a consideration of genuine operational importance in an army that was balancing training time across a vast range of competing requirements. The Wombat's operation could be taught to a competent soldier in a relatively short training program, with proficiency developing through practice that was straightforward to organize and conduct. The guided missile systems of the period required longer initial training, continuous practice to maintain the manual guidance skills that hit probability demanded, and periodic refresher training that imposed ongoing demands on the training program. The cumulative training advantage of the simpler system was significant when considered across the full service life of a weapon, and the large number of crews that needed to be trained and maintained at operational standard. The maintenance requirements of the Wombat reflected its mechanical simplicity in ways that were practically significant for field operations. The weapon's construction was robust, and the number of components requiring specialist maintenance was limited. Field maintenance tasks that crews could perform themselves included cleaning, lubrication, and inspection of the barrel, breech, and mounting, all of which could be accomplished with standard tools and the knowledge imparted during basic training. More complex maintenance requiring workshop attention was infrequent in normal service conditions. This maintenance simplicity reduced the logistical burden of supporting the Wombat in the field and meant that the weapon was available for use at a higher proportion of its operational life than weapons with more demanding maintenance requirements. The vehicle-mounted versions of the Wombat provided the weapon with the tactical mobility that offset some of the limitations imposed by its weight and size. Mounted on the Land Rover, the standard British military light vehicle, the Wombat became a highly mobile anti-tank system capable of rapid movement to threatened areas, quick deployment from the vehicle, and withdrawal after engagement before enemy forces could respond. the Land Rover mounting was not a complex or sophisticated integration of weapon and vehicle, but rather a practical adaptation that allowed the Wombat to be carried to its firing position and then dismounted for use, with the vehicle providing the mobility that the weapon itself lacked. This simplicity of integration was itself an advantage, requiring minimal specialized training or maintenance beyond what was already needed for the weapon and the vehicle separately. The employment of the Wombat in the tactical framework of the British Army in Germany, facing the potential of a Soviet armoured advance across the North German plain, was developed through extensive training and exercise experience that refined the understanding of how the weapon could best be used within combined arms formations. The Wombat was a part of the battalion anti-tank capability, positioned and employed to complement the anti-tank weapons of other units and the capabilities of the tank formations with which the infantry worked. Its specific role in this framework was determined by its strengths, primarily its immediate response capability, its HESH effectiveness against a range of target types, and its independence from the guidance demands that first-generation missiles imposed, and its limitations, primarily its backblast signature and the weight that constrained its tactical mobility in cross-country conditions. The practical experience of Wombat crews in exercises and field training provided a body of operational knowledge about the weapon's characteristics that supplemented and sometimes corrected the theoretical analysis of its capabilities. Crews discovered that the backblast, while a significant tactical liability in terms of position disclosure, could sometimes be exploited as a psychological weapon against enemy infantry who were not expecting the dramatic visual and acoustic effect of a recoilless gun firing at close range. They learned the specific terrain features that provided adequate backblast clearance, while still offering effective firing positions. They developed the team coordination that allowed rapid loading and engagement sequences that extracted maximum tactical advantage from the weapon's direct fire capability. The Wombat's service life extended through the 1960s, 70s and into the 80s, surviving the introduction of successive generations of guided missile systems that were each predicted to render it obsolete. The Milan missile, introduced into British service in the mid-1970s, was a second-generation ATGM that addressed many of the guidance difficulties of first-generation systems through a semi-automatic command-to-line-of-sight guidance system that required the operator only to keep the target in his sight, with the system automatically generating the guidance commands needed to keep the missile on the line of sight. Milan was a genuinely effective weapon that significantly raised the standard of guided missile performance, and it eventually did displace the Wombat in the primary anti-tank role. But the replacement took longer than anyone had predicted when the Wombat first entered service, because the qualities that had sustained the recoilless gun through the first decade of the guided missile era continued to be recognized as valuable even as missile technology improved. The Falklands War of 1982, in which British forces deployed to the South Atlantic to recapture the Falkland Islands from Argentine occupation, provided the Wombat with an unexpected final operational context that illustrated both its enduring utility and the conditions under which its specific qualities were most relevant. In the harsh conditions of the Falklands, where the cold, wet terrain and the logistical constraints of operating at extreme range from any support base placed a premium on equipment reliability and simplicity, the Wombat's characteristics were well suited to operational requirements. The absence of Soviet main battle tanks as primary targets meant that the Wombat's anti-armor role was somewhat different from its intended Cold War application, but its direct fire capability against fortified positions and its HESH ammunition's effectiveness against a range of target types gave it genuine utility in the specific tactical situation encountered. The legacy of the L6 Wombat in British military history is that of a weapon which was consistently underestimated by those who evaluated it against theoretical measures of capability and consistently valued by those who operated it in the practical conditions of military service. The theorists who predicted its rapid obsolescence were not wrong about the technical capabilities of the guided missile systems that were introduced alongside and after it. Those systems did offer capabilities that the recoilless gun could not match in certain important respects, but they were wrong about the importance of those capabilities relative to the practical attributes of reliability, simplicity, training efficiency, and operational robustness that determined how effective a weapon system actually was in the hands of real soldiers in real conditions. The Wombat story is ultimately the story of a weapon that understood its limitations and performed within them with consistent excellence. It was not the most sophisticated anti-tank weapon in the British arsenal, it was not the longest ranged, it was not the most precise in its guidance after the round left the barrel, and it was not the stealthiest in terms of its firing signature. What it was, for 3 decades of Cold War service, was reliable, effective, and trusted. Qualities that are rarer in military equipment than the specifications suggest, and more valuable in practice than the theorists appreciate. The soldiers who operated the Wombat understood this, and their confidence in the weapon was earned through the accumulated experience of training and exercise that demonstrated again and again that when the system was needed it would perform. In that confidence lay the true measure of the L6 Wombat's achievement, and in that achievement lay a lesson about military equipment that remains as relevant today as it was when the first Wombat crews trained on the plains of Germany in the 1960s, preparing to face an armoured threat that fortunately never came but that they were genuinely ready to meet.